Jurassic Park took audiences by storm in 1993 on its release, with a beautiful location, an amazing director in Steven Spielberg, who had mastered the blockbuster by this point, and visual effects that were probably over a decade ahead of its time. Audiences could not get enough of seeing dinosaurs come to life on the big screen. And while there are many amazing scenes throughout this film, there's one that most likely stuck with every single person from the first time they've watched it and remains amazing every single time seeing it thereafter, and that is the T-Rex escape scene in the rain. This scene is the epitome of a monster horror scene. It is dark, scary, there is absolutely no score. Every sound the T-Rex makes, you can feel the impact, and it is wonderfully acted by every single actor in the scene.
Dr. Grant?
My parents still tell me stories about when they saw this movie in theaters, and my older brother, who was only 3 at the time, hid under the seat during this scene because it was so terrifying. But what exactly is it about this scene that makes it so memorable? Well, we're going to break down a few of the effects that Steven Spielberg chose to go with that makes this scene so special and one of the all-time greats in monster horror. I mentioned before about the lack of score in this scene. I think that it was crucial, and it was a brilliant choice by Spielberg to not add any music. Just having to hear the sounds of the kids being terrified, Dr. Alan Grant and Ian Malcolm trying to figure out how to save them, and Rexy's footsteps and roars piercing through the rain gives it this terrifying, helpless feel. Adding to that, the way the scene is shot is almost entirely from the perspective of our characters, and mostly through the perspective of Tim and Lex, the children. Seeing this through Tim and Lex's eyes and not the adult's eyes helps add to the helplessness and terrifying feel of the scene, whereas earlier Tim and Lex were giving us a feel of wonder and awe and seeing the dinosaurs alive for the first time. They now are giving us as a gateway to perspective of how terrifying these creatures actually are when they're allowed to run free. Now granted, we can talk about the characters and the humans in this scene all day long, but the real character that seals the show is Rexy herself. I mean, look at her. Rexy has got to be one of the best practical effects and props ever made in all of cinema. I mean, they actually built the frickin' T-Rex. In pretty much every behind-the-scenes documentary, Steven Spielberg talks about how much of a nightmare the shark from Jaws and Rexy were to work with. The scene being shot in the rain helps cover up the imperfections in the robot's movement, but it also meant that they had to stop filming about every 5 minutes to blow dry the T-Rex to keep it from short-circuiting. However, the effect it pulled off was worth it. I mean, this scene playing right now, or this portion of the scene rather, would not be the same if they did it with CGI or some half T-Rex. I mean, you can see and feel the scale just from the size of the actual robot itself. Rexy being a real-life practical prop mixed with a little bit of CGI like this portion playing here made the scene seem and feel so much more real than it actually is. The editing techniques that they couple with Rexy also helps bring her to life. She's hardly ever fully on the screen except for the CG portions, which helps, again, cover up the imperfections of a robot's movement. And the constant cutting back to Lex and Tim's perspective or Alan and Ian's perspective gives the sense of horror and also scale even greater effect because we're always looking up at her almost. We never see her from eye level or see the characters from her level, except for a very few quick shots. We also can't forget to mention her roar. I mean, it's absolutely perfect. It is terrifying, but it feels realistic at the same time, and you can actually believe that a dinosaur from 65 million years ago would make that sound. Another underrated aspect of her is also the power and sound in her movements. You can hear the mud squishing and the tremors that her footprints create. They never get away from that in this movie like they do in the subsequent sequels to this franchise. Another portion of the sound that is also, I think, underrated and underappreciated is the mud sound effects that come from Tim and Lex's perspective once the car is flipped over. It is this sticky, gooey, it makes you feel wet and sticky like they must feel after being stuck under that car this whole time. Coupled with the amazing sound design is the actual lighting of the scene. While there isn't really an explanation for why it is so brightly lit with whites and blue light as it is, other than lightning, I think it was a perfect choice from Spielberg and his set design team to give the shadow effects from Rexy, which gives her an even bigger and more contrasted appearance, as well as spotlight some of the acting and different facial expressions done by the actors. I think this portion of the scene really highlights the lighting effects of Rexy's face going from in the shadows right here to turning and becoming more in the spotlight and well lit, really highlighting this texture on her skin, the sharp teeth in her mouth that have a crocodilian-like overlap with her lips, and it takes Alan and Lex from being well lit initially to more poorly lit as she turns her head. And while we could sit here and talk about the marvel that is what they did with practical effects in this scene, and really throughout this movie, I think this scene also serves a huge purpose in the moral that the story is trying to tell, which is that you can't control nature or evolution. This is the moment that they've been building towards, that the character's been warning John Hammond about, and that the lawyer seems to have overlooked. This is what happens when you try to play God. Nature will fight back, nature will break free, and to quote Ian Malcolm, life finds a way. I think everything I've explained here is just a snapshot and a small sighting into what makes the scene so special, but it really could be broken down further and further, probably for decades to come, and will honestly, no matter what happens, still be one of, if not the best single scene in any monster horror film ever created.